Some people think character is revealed when the world is watching, but the truth is much quieter than that. Character is revealed when someone believes no one will ever know what they chose to do. The 42nd floor of Whitmore Financial Tower was unusually still that night, the kind of silence that settles over a building long after the last elevator chime fades and the city outside becomes a distant glow of headlights and glass. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan stretched like a grid of restless stars, yellow taxis sliding through avenues, steam rising from street vents, and somewhere far below a siren drifting through the cool air. Inside the executive conference room, the lights had been dimmed just enough to make the polished walnut table shine like dark water. Claire Whitmore sat at the far end of that table, perfectly motionless in a leather chair that cost more than most people's monthly rent. At 32, she had already built a reputation that made entire boardrooms fall quiet when she entered. Investors called her brilliant. Competitors called her ruthless. Employees simply called her the CEO. But tonight she was doing something no business school ever taught. Her head rested lightly against the back of the chair. Her eyes were closed. To anyone walking in, she looked exhausted, like a woman who had finally fallen asleep after a 14-hour day of negotiations and numbers. But Claire Whitmore was not asleep. Not even close. Behind the darkened glass wall that overlooked the hallway, for members of the senior leadership team watched a bank of security monitors in silence. A small red recording light blinked steadily on each screen. The test had already begun. Over the past hour, several employees had passed through the conference room under different pretexts. A junior analyst had stepped in first, glanced around nervously, then quietly taken a photo of the sleeping CEO before slipping out again. A project manager had followed, whispering a joke to himself about burnout before closing the door behind him. Another employee had stood near the table long enough to scroll through a stack of documents, curiosity winning over caution. None of them knew the cameras were capturing every second. None of them knew Claire could hear almost everything. Now the hallway outside the conference room was empty again, the carpet absorbing the soft hum of the building's ventilation system. Somewhere down the corridor, an elevator door opened with a quiet ding. Footsteps approached slowly, steady but unhurried. On the monitor screens, one of the executives leaned forward in his chair. "That's him," he murmured. The man stepping toward the conference room door was not an executive, not a manager, not anyone most people in the building paid much attention to. Marcus Reed was a facilities technician, the kind of employee who fixed lights before anyone noticed they had flickered and adjusted thermostats before someone complained about the temperature. He was also a single father who left the building every evening at exactly 6:15 p.m. to pick up his 8-year-old son from an after-school science club in Queens. Tonight he had stayed late to finish repairing a climate control panel on the 39th floor. He still wore a navy maintenance jacket with his name stitched in simple white thread over the chest. In the quiet hallway he paused outside the conference room, glancing at the partially opened door. Inside, the CEO appeared to be asleep at the end of the long table, her phone face down beside a neat stack of briefing folders. Marcus stood there for a moment, one hand resting lightly against the doorframe, as if deciding whether to step inside or quietly walk away. Behind the glass, four executives held their breath without realizing it. On the other side of the door, Marcus Reed gently pushed it open and walked into the room, unaware that the smallest decision he made in the next few minutes would be remembered far longer than any quarterly report the company had ever filed. Marcus Reed did not rush. That was the first thing the cameras noticed. He stepped fully into the conference room and gently closed the door behind him, careful not to let the latch click too loudly in the quiet space. The room smelled faintly of polished wood and fresh coffee that had long since gone cold. The long table stretched almost 20 feet across the room, lined with empty leather chairs that seemed to hold the ghosts of earlier meetings, the kind where numbers decided the direction of entire industries. At the far end sat Claire Whitmore, her head tilted slightly to one side, her eyes closed, one hand resting near the folders on the table. Marcus stopped walking about 10 feet away from her chair. He did not say her name. He did not clear his throat. He simply looked at her for a moment with the calm attention of someone used to noticing small things in quiet rooms. Behind the dark glass wall in the adjacent observation office, the executives leaned closer to their monitors. One of them folded his arms, waiting for the same reactions they had already seen earlier that evening. A whispered comment. A photograph. A quick glance through the documents sitting beside the sleeping chief executive officer. But Marcus Reed did none of those things. Instead, he took a slow breath and glanced around the room, as if measuring the space itself. The overhead lights were brighter than necessary for a room where only one person remained. He reached toward the wall panel and lowered the lights slightly until the room softened into a calmer glow. The change was subtle, but the sharp reflections on the table faded into a warmer tone. Claire Whitmore remained perfectly still in her chair, though behind her closed eyelids, she was listening carefully to every small sound in the room. Marcus then walked toward the thermostat panel near the door. He looked at the display for a moment. 67 degrees. Too cold for someone who had fallen asleep after a long day. With the quiet precision of someone who had adjusted thousands of climate systems, he tapped the panel once and raised the temperature by 2 degrees. The ventilation system hummed gently in response. On the monitors in the observation room, one executive shifted in his seat. Another quietly muttered, "That is different." Marcus turned back toward the table. Claire still had not moved. A small crease had formed between her brows, the kind that appears when exhaustion begins to weigh on someone who has been awake far too long. Marcus noticed. People who worked in maintenance learned to notice small signs. A flickering light, a loose hinge, the quiet strain in someone's shoulders. He stepped closer to the table but stopped again a respectful distance away, careful not to crowd the space around her chair. His eyes briefly moved to the stack of documents resting beside her hand. Financial reports, contract summaries, important papers that many people in the company would have given anything to read before a meeting. Marcus did not touch them. Instead, he gently pulled one of the empty chairs from the side of the table and set it a few feet away from Claire's seat. From the back of his maintenance jacket, he removed a folded cleaning cloth and laid it quietly on the chair, almost like placing a small cushion there. Then he reached into his tool bag and took out a sealed bottle of water he had been carrying since earlier that afternoon. He set it carefully on the table near her elbow. Not too close. Not close enough to wake her if she shifted in her sleep. Just within reach. The room returned to silence again. Outside the windows, the city lights continued to glow, distant and restless. Marcus glanced once more toward Claire Whitmore. His voice, when he finally spoke, was barely louder than a breath. Long days should end with quiet, even for someone who runs the whole building. And with that, he stepped back, unaware that 4 people behind a sheet of dark glass had just stopped speaking entirely. Marcus Reed remained still for another moment after speaking, as if giving the quiet room permission to stay quiet. The city outside continued its distant rhythm, traffic flowing like slow rivers of light between towers of glass and steel. Inside the conference room, the air felt different now, softer, warmer by only a couple of degrees, but enough to change the feeling of the space. Marcus glanced once more toward Claire Whitmore. Her breathing remained slow and steady, the kind that comes when exhaustion finally wins over discipline. For a brief second, his expression shifted into something thoughtful, the look of a man remembering how long a day can be when responsibility refuses to end. Then he turned slightly and noticed the large digital wall clock above the glass display cabinet. It read 9:42 p.m. Marcus quietly reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out his phone. The screen lit his face for only a second. A small photo appeared on the lock screen, a boy missing his 2 front teeth, holding a cardboard rocket painted silver. Marcus smiled faintly before locking the phone again. The boy's after-school program would already be finished by now, and a neighbor down the hall in Queens was keeping an eye on him until Marcus returned home. It had been that kind of evening, one more repair job that took longer than expected, one more promise to be a little late. Marcus slipped the phone back into his pocket and looked around the room once more. The folders near Claire's hand caught the light again, the titles printed in bold letters that spoke of mergers and numbers large enough to change markets. For a moment, he studied them the way a mechanic studies a complicated engine he has no intention of taking apart. He could have read them. No one would have known. The thought passed through his mind just long enough to disappear. Instead, he reached for a small pen resting near the folders and gently slid it closer to the top page so it would not roll off the table if someone shifted. It was the kind of small adjustment most people never noticed, the quiet habit of someone used to keeping things in order. In the observation room behind the dark glass, the executives had grown unusually quiet. One of them leaned forward, resting both hands on the table as he watched the monitor. Another slowly shook his head, as if something about the moment did not match the expectations he had brought into the room earlier that evening. On the screen, Marcus took a step backward, then another, careful not to make the leather chair legs scrape against the polished floor. His movements were deliberate, respectful of the silence that now settled over the room like a blanket. Before reaching the door, he paused once more and looked back at the sleeping chief executive officer. The city lights reflected faintly across the glass behind her chair, turning the window into a mirror of distant gold and blue. Marcus studied that reflection for a second, as if considering the weight of everything that office represented. Then he spoke again, softer than before, almost like a quiet thought spoken out loud. Some people carry the whole building on their shoulders, and nobody ever tells them it is all right to rest. His words drifted gently into the room and disappeared into the soft hum of the ventilation system. With that, Marcus reached for the door handle and slowly opened it, ready to leave the room exactly as quietly as he had entered, unaware that on the other side of the glass 4 people were staring at the monitor in complete silence, realizing that the simplest actions were often the hardest to predict. Marcus Reed opened the conference room door slowly, careful that the handle did not click against the frame. The hallway beyond was quiet, the thick corporate carpet absorbing the sound of his boots as he stepped out. The door remained open for a moment behind him, allowing the soft light of the conference room to spill gently into the corridor before he reached back and closed it with the same quiet care he had used when entering. Inside the room, Claire Whitmore remained motionless in her chair, her eyes still closed, her breathing steady. The bottle of water now rested within reach of her hand, and the dimmed lights softened the sharp lines of the long table. Outside the room, Marcus paused briefly in the hallway and glanced toward the elevators at the far end of the corridor. The digital panel above them displayed a descending number from a floor far above. Somewhere in the building, a cleaning cart rolled faintly across polished tile. For Marcus, the moment had already passed. He adjusted the strap of his tool bag across his shoulder and began walking toward the elevator with the calm pace of someone finishing the final task of a long day. But behind the dark observation glass, the room of executives had not moved. For several seconds after Marcus closed the door, no one spoke. The monitors continued to display the quiet conference room from multiple angles, the still figure of Claire Whitmore at the end of the table, the empty chair nearby, the bottle of water catching a small reflection from the overhead lights. Finally, one of the senior directors leaned back in his seat and let out a slow breath he had not realized he had been holding. "That was not what I expected," he said quietly. Another executive nodded without looking away from the screen. Earlier that evening they had seen curiosity, opportunism, and even quiet mockery. What they had not seen until now was restraint. On the monitor, Claire Whitmore slowly opened her eyes. The change was almost imperceptible at first, a slight shift of her gaze toward the door Marcus had just closed. She remained seated for several seconds, absorbing the silence he had left behind. Her eyes moved across the table, the bottle of water, the pen aligned neatly beside the documents, the lowered lighting that softened the room. Small gestures, simple and unannounced, yet each one carried a quiet kind of attention. Claire sat forward slowly, resting her hands on the polished table. Her expression was thoughtful rather than surprised. The executives behind the glass watched carefully, waiting for her reaction. One of them reached for the intercom switch, but stopped before pressing it. Claire Whitmore lifted the bottle of water and studied it for a moment before placing it back down gently. Then she spoke, her voice calm but clear enough to reach the observation room microphone. "Did you see what he did not do?" The executives glanced at one another. Claire leaned back in her chair again and looked toward the dark glass wall, knowing very well that the leadership team stood on the other side. "He did not read the documents. He did not take a photograph. He did not wake me to show respect. Instead, he protected the quiet." The observation room fell silent again. On the monitor, the chief executive officer rested her hands together on the table as if considering something carefully. After a few seconds, she stood up from the chair, smoothing the sleeve of her jacket. Through the glass, she could see the faint outline of the executives watching her reaction. Claire Whitmore walked slowly toward the conference room door Marcus had used only moments earlier. As she reached the handle, she paused and spoke again, her tone thoughtful rather than commanding. Tomorrow morning, I want to know everything about Marcus Reed. Not his job title. Not his employee file. I want to know who he is when he thinks no one is watching. The elevator doors slid open with a quiet mechanical whisper just as Marcus Reed reached the end of the hallway. He stepped inside and pressed the button for the lobby, his reflection briefly appearing in the brushed steel walls around him. The elevator began its slow descent from the 42nd floor, each passing number glowing softly above the door. Marcus loosened the collar of his maintenance jacket and exhaled a long breath, the kind a person releases after a day that stretched longer than expected. For him, the night was nearly over. He was thinking about the subway ride back to Queens, about the small apartment where a lamp would still be glowing in the kitchen window, about a boy who probably fell asleep waiting to hear how the cardboard rocket experiment had gone. At school, the elevator hummed steadily as it moved downward through the tower, past floors filled with darkened offices and silent conference rooms. High above, on the 42nd floor, Claire Whitmore stood near the conference room door, her hand resting lightly on the handle Marcus had just used. Through the dark observation glass, the senior executives watched her carefully. Claire did not open the door immediately. Instead, she looked back toward the long table, toward the small changes Marcus had made without knowing anyone was watching. The bottle of water, the softened lighting, the careful distance he kept between himself and the stack of confidential reports. Each detail remained exactly where he had left it, quiet evidence of a decision that had not been forced or measured. Claire finally opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The corridor was empty now, the same calm stretch of carpet Marcus had walked only minutes earlier. She glanced toward the elevator at the far end of the hall, though she knew he would already be gone. Behind her, the executives slowly filed out of the observation room. One of them spoke first, his voice thoughtful rather than skeptical. "We ran the same scenario with 5 different employees tonight." Claire Whitmore turned slightly toward him, but did not interrupt. The executive continued, his eyes still reflecting the glow of the monitor screens. "Every one of them did something they should not have done. Curiosity is a difficult habit to resist." Claire nodded once, her gaze still drifting toward the quiet elevator doors at the end of the corridor. Marcus Reed had not seemed curious at all. Another executive cleared his throat and opened a tablet, already scrolling through internal employee files. Marcus Reed, facilities technician, employed here for 3 years. He paused as he read the next lines more carefully. Single father. Lives in Queens. No disciplinary reports. Consistently positive maintenance evaluations. Claire listened without speaking, absorbing each fact like pieces of a larger picture forming in her mind. Down in the lobby, the elevator doors opened again and Marcus stepped out into the wide marble atrium of the building. The night security guard at the front desk lifted a hand in a friendly wave. "Long night, Marcus." Marcus smiled and returned the gesture as he crossed the polished floor toward the exit doors. "Just finishing up," he replied. Outside, the cool New York air greeted him with the distant sound of traffic and the faint smell of street vendors closing their carts for the evening. Marcus pulled his jacket tighter and began walking toward the subway entrance half a block away. Behind him, the tall glass tower rose into the sky, floor after floor of quiet offices where decisions shaped millions of dollars every day. Marcus did not look back at it. For him, the building was simply a place where broken things were repaired and lights were kept working. But high above, on the 42nd floor, Claire Whitmore was still standing in the hallway, her thoughts lingering on the quiet man who had walked into her conference room and left it more peaceful than he found it. After a moment, she turned to the executives beside her and spoke with calm certainty. "Tomorrow morning, I want him in my office at 9 o'clock. The subway train rattled beneath the East River long before the city above began to glow with morning light. Marcus Reed sat quietly near the end of the train car, his tool bag resting beside his boots and his jacket folded across his lap. Around him, the early commuters of New York moved through their routines with the quiet focus of people beginning another long day. Some stared into their phones. Others leaned against the metal poles with tired eyes half closed. Marcus watched the dark tunnel outside the window blur past and thought about the small apartment waiting at the end of the ride. When the train finally pulled into Queens, he stepped onto the platform and climbed the stairs into the cool morning air. The sky had just begun to soften into pale blue above the row of brick buildings lining the street. A few blocks away, a bakery door opened, and the warm smell of fresh bread drifted across the sidewalk. Marcus walked the familiar path home, his footsteps steady and unhurried. On the third floor of a narrow apartment building, a kitchen light glowed behind a thin curtain. When Marcus unlocked the door and stepped inside, the small living room greeted him with the quiet evidence of a child who had fallen asleep waiting. A school backpack leaned against the couch. A cardboard rocket painted silver rested on the coffee table beside a sheet of paper covered in handwritten numbers and drawings. Marcus smiled faintly as he set his tool bag near the door. In the bedroom down the short hallway, his son lay asleep beneath a blanket decorated with small planets and stars. Marcus stood in the doorway for a moment, watching the slow rise and fall of the boy's breathing before gently pulling the blanket a little higher over his shoulders. The boy stirred slightly, but did not wake. Marcus returned to the kitchen and poured himself a cup of water from the tap. The clock above the stove read 6:15 in the morning. In less than 2 hours, he would already be back on the subway heading toward Manhattan again. High above the city, the glass tower of Whitmore Financial reflected the first rays of sunlight across its many windows. Inside the executive floor, the building was already awake. Claire Whitmore stood near the wide windows of her office, looking out across the skyline with a cup of black coffee warming her hands. The city below was beginning to move, yellow taxis filling the avenues, delivery trucks stopping beside office towers, thousands of people starting their daily climb into another day of meetings and decisions. Behind her, the door opened quietly, and one of the senior executives stepped inside, carrying a tablet. "You asked for everything we could find about Marcus Reed," he said. Claire Whitmore turned from the window and nodded once. The executive began reading carefully from the screen. 38 years old. Facilities technician. Former mechanical systems apprentice before joining Whitmore Financial 3 years ago. No disciplinary actions. Perfect attendance record except for 2 sick days last winter. The executive paused for a moment before continuing. Widowed 5 years ago. Raising one son alone. Claire listened without interrupting, her expression calm but thoughtful. Outside the office windows, the city sunlight continued to spread across the glass buildings of Manhattan. The executive finished scrolling through the file and lowered the tablet slightly. "That is everything in the employee records." Claire Whitmore walked slowly back toward her desk and rested her coffee cup beside a stack of morning reports. After a moment, she spoke quietly. "That is not everything." The executive looked up in mild confusion. Claire Whitmore glanced once more toward the skyline before answering. "Files tell you what someone has done when people were watching. Last night we saw who he is when he believes no one is watching." Morning traffic filled the avenues of Manhattan with its familiar rhythm by the time Marcus Reed stepped out of the subway station. The air carried the scent of roasted coffee and warm bagels drifting from street carts already surrounded by commuters. Marcus adjusted the strap of his tool bag over his shoulder and joined the steady flow of people walking toward the towers of glass and steel that defined the financial district. The Whitmore Financial building rose above the block like a polished mirror reflecting the bright blue sky. Marcus had walked through those doors hundreds of times before, yet to him it had always been simply another workplace where things broke and were quietly repaired. Inside the lobby, the marble floor gleamed beneath the morning light pouring through the tall glass entrance. The security guard at the front desk greeted him with the same friendly nod as the night before. "Morning, Marcus." Marcus returned the gesture with a small smile. "Morning. Busy day ahead." He crossed the wide atrium toward the employee elevators, unaware that his name had already traveled far above him through the executive floor. On the 42nd floor, Claire Whitmore stood beside her desk reviewing the first reports of the day. Her office was large but uncluttered, its design calm and deliberate. The skyline of New York stretched beyond the wide windows behind her, the East River glinting in the distance. One of the executives from the previous night remained standing near the door holding a tablet. "You still want him here at 9 o'clock?" he asked carefully. Claire Whitmore glanced at the clock mounted on the wall. 8:42. "Yes. Exactly at 9. The executive hesitated before speaking again. "He is a facilities technician. He may assume something is wrong if he is suddenly called to the executive office." Claire Whitmore allowed the faintest hint of a smile to appear. "That may be true," she said calmly. "Then he will arrive honest." Down in the maintenance office on the lower floors, Marcus had just begun checking the list of daily work orders when the phone on the wall rang. The supervisor answered, listened for a moment, then slowly lowered the receiver with a puzzled expression. "Marcus," he called across the room. Marcus looked up from a clipboard. "Yes." The supervisor scratched the side of his head before continuing. "You are being asked to report to the executive floor." Marcus blinked once, certain he had misheard. "The executive floor?" "Yes." The supervisor nodded toward the elevator hall. "Apparently the chief executive officer would like to speak with you." For a brief second, the small maintenance room fell completely silent. Marcus stood still, holding the clipboard in one hand. He had worked in the building long enough to know that maintenance technicians were rarely summoned to the executive level unless something had gone very wrong with the building systems. He placed the clipboard down carefully on the table. "All right," he said quietly. "I will go now." The elevator ride upward felt longer than usual. Floor numbers glowed one after another as the car rose through the tower. Marcus stood alone inside, his reflection staring back at him from the steel walls. By the time the doors opened onto the executive floor, the hallway was already active, with assistants moving between offices and quiet conversations drifting through the air. A receptionist looked up from her desk and immediately stood when she saw him. "Mr. Reed," she said politely, "the chief executive officer is expecting you." She gestured toward the large double doors at the end of the corridor. Marcus thanked her softly and began walking down the long hallway, each step echoing faintly against the polished floor. Behind those doors, Claire Whitmore stood near her desk, already watching the hallway through the glass panel beside the entrance, waiting to meet the quiet man who had chosen respect when he believed no one in the world was paying attention. Marcus Reed stopped just outside the double doors of the executive office for a brief second, not out of fear, but out of respect for the space he was about to enter. The hallway behind him carried the quiet rhythm of assistants moving between desks and the faint tapping of keyboards beginning the day's work. Through the glass panel beside the door, he could see the large office beyond, wide windows filled with morning sunlight and the outline of the city stretching beyond them. Marcus adjusted the sleeve of his maintenance jacket and knocked gently on the door. Inside, Claire Whitmore heard the sound and simply said, "Come in." Her voice was calm, neither cold nor overly formal, the tone of someone used to being listened to. Marcus opened the door and stepped inside. The office was larger than most apartments in the city, yet it did not feel overwhelming. The space was organized with quiet precision, a wide desk near the center, bookshelves along one wall, and floor-to-ceiling windows revealing the skyline of Manhattan behind her. Claire Whitmore stood near the desk, one hand resting lightly on the edge as she looked toward him. Marcus stopped a respectful distance away. "Good morning, ma'am," he said politely. Claire nodded once. "Good morning, Mr. Reed." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence in the room was not uncomfortable. It was the kind that appears when two people are quietly measuring each other for the first time. Claire Whitmore walked slowly around the desk and gestured toward a chair near the window. "Please sit." Marcus hesitated for only a moment before sitting carefully, placing his tool bag beside his boots. Claire remained standing for a second longer, studying him the same way she had studied the monitor screen the night before. There was nothing dramatic about Marcus Reed. He looked exactly like what he was, a man who spent his days repairing systems and solving practical problems. His jacket was clean but worn from work. His hands carried the quiet strength of someone used to tools rather than boardrooms. Claire finally spoke. "Do you remember entering the conference room on the 42nd floor last night?" Marcus blinked once in mild surprise. "Yes, ma'am. I saw that the lights were still on and thought someone had forgotten to turn them down." Claire nodded slowly. "And you noticed someone in the room?" "Yes, ma'am. You appeared to be asleep." Claire studied his expression carefully. "What made you decide not to wake me?" Marcus did not answer immediately. He glanced briefly toward the wide windows where the morning sun reflected across the river before returning his gaze to her. "You look tired," he said simply. Claire waited. Marcus continued quietly. "When someone works that hard, sleep is probably the only quiet moment they get. I did not think it would be right to interrupt that." Claire Whitmore folded her hands together thoughtfully. "Many people entered that room last night," she said. "Some looked through documents. Some used their phones." Marcus looked genuinely surprised. "I did not realize anyone else had been there." Claire allowed a faint smile to appear. "They had. Been there earlier. You were the last one. Marcus nodded slowly, still unsure where the conversation was leading. Claire walked toward the window and looked down at the moving city far below. Then she turned back to him and asked the question that had stayed with her since the previous night. Mr. Reed, she said calmly, do you always treat people that way when you believe no one is watching? Marcus Reed did not answer the question immediately. The sunlight from the wide windows reached across the polished floor and rested quietly between them, as if even the room itself was waiting. He sat with his hands resting loosely together, thinking for a moment about how to explain something that had never really required explanation before. Finally, he looked up at Claire Whitmore and gave a small, thoughtful nod. Yes, ma'am, he said simply. I try to. Claire studied his expression carefully. There was no pride in his voice, no attempt to impress. It sounded like the most ordinary answer in the world. She walked slowly back toward the desk and leaned lightly against its edge. Most people behave differently when they think they are being watched, she said. Marcus gave a quiet half-smile. My son is 8 years old. He watches everything. Claire tilted her head slightly, curious. Marcus continued in the same calm tone. When you are raising a child alone, you realize pretty quickly that they are learning from things you do not even notice you are doing. How you treat strangers. How you talk to people who cannot help you. Whether you rush past someone who needs a moment of kindness. He paused briefly before finishing the thought. If I only behave well when someone important is watching, then sooner or later he will notice the difference. Claire Whitmore listened without interrupting. The quiet honesty of the explanation settled into the room more strongly than any rehearsed speech could have. She walked toward the window again and looked down at the busy streets far below. The city moved with its usual urgency, thousands of decisions unfolding every minute in offices, taxis, and crowded sidewalks. After a moment, she turned back toward him. Mr. Reed, she said, last night was not an accident. Marcus frowned slightly, unsure what she meant. Claire continued. The situation in the conference room was a test. Several employees entered that room. While I pretended to be asleep, Marcus remained still as the realization slowly reached him. Claire spoke gently, not accusingly, as if explaining a simple fact. Some people became curious. Some became careless. One person even thought it would be amusing to take a photograph. Marcus lowered his eyes for a moment, not in judgment, but in quiet disappointment at the thought. Claire Whitmore stepped closer and rested her hands lightly on the back of the chair across from him. You were the only person who treated the moment as if someone else's dignity mattered more than your curiosity. Marcus looked up again, slightly uncomfortable with the attention. I was only trying to be respectful, ma'am. Claire nodded once. Exactly. She walked back to her desk and picked up a single sheet of paper before returning to him. Whitmore Financial employs thousands of people, she said calmly. Every day, this building runs on contracts, numbers, and strategies. But none of those things matter if the people inside forget how to treat one another when the room becomes quiet. She placed the paper on the small table beside Marcus. It was not a disciplinary notice or a technical request. It was a new assignment authorization. I would like you to help me with something different, Mr. Reed. Marcus looked down at the page and then back at her with clear confusion. Claire Whitmore allowed a small, genuine smile to appear for the first time that morning. Every building needs someone who knows how to fix what breaks. But every company also needs someone who remembers why people deserve respect when no one is watching. And last night you reminded an entire leadership team of something we had almost forgotten.